Ruben Menace Reyes was not born into power. He fought, bled, and manipulated his way to it. Raised in the rough neighborhoods of San Antonio, Texas, he grew up surrounded by the culture of the streets, where gangs were not just organizations, but lifelines. Violence was a language, respect was currency, and betrayal meant death. The Texas Mexican Mafia, known simply as La M de Tejas, loomed large over the prisons and barrios of the state. By the time Reyes entered the system, he had already learned the rules that governed life in that shadow world. He was quiet but observant, more strategist than soldier, and it didn't take long for others to notice the calm ruthlessness that would come to define him. The Texas Mexican Mafia had been founded decades earlier, in the early 1980s, by incarcerated Mexican-American inmates seeking protection and dominance inside the brutal Texas prison system. Modeled after the infamous Mexican Mafia of California, but adapted to local conditions, the TMM became a hybrid organization, part prison gang, part organized crime syndicate. It operated with military discipline, maintaining a chain of command that mirrored the structure of an army. At the top sat generals. Below them, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, and foot soldiers known as soldados. Within this framework, every order had meaning. Every word was law, and disobedience could mean a death sentence. When Reyes joined, he embraced this hierarchy completely, seeing in it both a way to survive and a way to rise. Reyes' early years inside prison revealed his talent for leadership. He wasn't the loudest or most intimidating figure in the yard, but he commanded attention through composure. His approach to violence was surgical, never random, always calculated. Those who crossed him disappeared quietly, and those who followed him prospered. His ability to balance intimidation with loyalty earned him respect from both older members and younger recruits. Over time, his name, Menace, spread through units and corridors, whispered with a mixture of fear and admiration. To his followers, he was a man who understood power. To his enemies, he was a reminder that mercy was not part of the TMM code. As the Texas Mexican Mafia expanded beyond prison walls, Reyes saw opportunity. The organization had grown into a statewide empire, controlling drug distribution networks, extortion rings, and protection rackets, stretching from San Antonio to the Rio Grande Valley. Its influence reached into neighborhoods, nightclubs, and even legitimate businesses. Reyes became one of the architects of this expansion, coordinating operations both inside and outside prison. He knew how to keep soldiers motivated. Money for the loyal, punishment for the weak. Every deal and every murder reinforced the reputation that kept him untouchable. But power within the TMM was never stable. The gang's military-style structure often masked deep internal rivalries. Generals competed for control of drug routes. Captains schemed for more influence. Within that chaos, Reyes saw his chance to climb higher. His position as lieutenant of lieutenants gave him authority over multiple regions, essentially making him a commander who reported only to the highest generals. It was a role that came with both prestige and danger. Few men held that title for long. Most died in power struggles or were taken down by law enforcement. Reyes, however, believed he could outthink them all. By this point, he had mastered the art of survival through secrecy. He avoided unnecessary attention, blending street operations with legitimate businesses to create a facade of normalcy. He opened a tattoo parlor in San Antonio, a place that served both as a source of income and a hub for communication among TMM members. To the public, he was a businessman. To the underworld, he was one of the most feared and respected figures in Texas organized crime. Beneath his calm demeanor, however, The seeds of paranoia were already growing. Reyes had seen too many leaders fall, some betrayed by their own men, others taken out by rival gangs or police stings. He began to trust fewer people, relying only on a small circle of loyal enforcers who carried out his orders without question. The Texas Mexican Mafia thrived on loyalty, but loyalty within such a violent system was always conditional. Fear kept soldiers obedient, but it also bred resentment. Reyes' reputation for ruthlessness began to unsettle even those who had once praised him. Behind his back, whispers spread that he was becoming too powerful, too willing to cross the line even by TMM standards. He didn't care. To him, survival was not about friendship or morality. It was about control. Every execution, every order, and every dollar collected reaffirmed his authority. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a general in an ongoing war. As law enforcement pressure mounted across Texas, the TMM adapted, retreating deeper into secrecy. Reyes helped restructure parts of the organization, enforcing stricter communication channels and demanding total discipline. His soldiers were expected to follow orders without hesitation, and those who faltered were swiftly eliminated. The gang's internal justice system, brutal and absolute, was now under his command. But this system of fear would soon turn inward. In his pursuit of total dominance, Reyes began to view anyone who questioned him as a potential threat. Whether they were rivals, allies, or friends didn't matter. The line between loyalty and betrayal had blurred, and he was ready to kill anyone who crossed it. By the early 2000s, Ruben "Menace" Reyes had become the embodiment of the Texas Mexican Mafia's violent evolution. A man who ruled through terror, discipline, and absolute conviction. He was no longer just enforcing the gang's code. He was redefining it in his image. Yet beneath the surface of his empire, cracks were forming. Old debts, internal disputes, and his growing paranoia were steering him toward an inevitable collision with his own organization. For all his calculated control, Reyes was entering a chapter where every move would cost him more than he ever imagined. The menace was at his peak, but so was the storm gathering to bring him down. By the time 2013 arrived, Ruben "Menace" Reyes stood near the top of the Texas Mexican Mafia's power structure. To the outside world, he was a quiet businessman, running a tattoo parlor in San Antonio. But behind the closed doors of that shop, Reyes ruled like a warlord, overseeing drug trafficking routes, enforcing discipline, and collecting tributes from soldiers across Texas. The TMM operated under a brutal code: obedience, secrecy, and loyalty unto death. But those principles were only as strong as the man enforcing them. Under Reyes, that code became twisted. What once served as the glue that held the organization together began to turn into a weapon of paranoia and fear. It was during this period that the first real fracture appeared. In October 2013, Reyes ordered the killing of Ulysses Farias, a fellow TMM member whom he believed had broken the most sacred rule: cooperation with the law enforcement. Farias was not just another soldier. He was part of Reyes' inner circle, a trusted ally who had helped him manage street-level operations. But rumors spread that Farias had been questioned by federal agents, and that alone was enough to seal his fate. Reyes confronted him in his own home, in front of his family. Without hesitation or mercy, Reyes executed him, sending a message to anyone who might even think about talking. The murder was brutal, but it wasn't just about silencing Farias. It was about reinforcing Reyes' dominance. In the underworld, reputation was survival, and Reyes ensured his stayed intact through blood. The killing of Farias marked a turning point. Reyes had crossed from pragmatic violence into something darker, a paranoia-fueled campaign of control. His soldiers followed orders, but they did so out of fear, not respect. Each new death widened the gap between Reyes and the rest of the TMM leadership. The organization, once bound by a sense of collective power, was now being consumed from within. Reyes' ambition and mistrust made him unpredictable. Even his most loyal lieutenants began to wonder who might be next. Tensions exploded months later over money. In January 2014, Reyes accused 3 senior members, Captain Mark Bernal, General Carlos Chapa, and Lieutenant of Lieutenants Johnny Solis, of mishandling $60,000 in gang funds. In the world of the Texas Mexican Mafia, missing money wasn't a financial issue. It was an act of treason. To Reyes, the loss represented both disrespect and weakness. He summoned the men under the guise of resolving the dispute, but had already made up his mind. The meeting became an ambush. All 3 were executed on his orders, their bodies buried in a makeshift grave near Pearsall, Texas. The murders sent shockwaves through the Texas Mexican Mafia. 3 respected leaders, men who had served for years, had vanished without explanation. Inside prison walls, word spread quickly. Some claimed Reyes was cleaning house to tighten his control. Others whispered that he had lost his grip on reality. The gang's chain of command began to buckle under the weight of distrust. Soldiers didn't know whom to answer to anymore, and regional commanders hesitated to make decisions without fearing retribution. Reyes' attempt to strengthen his rule was, ironically, tearing the organization apart. Despite the growing unease, Reyes continued to project an image of control. His ability to move between the streets and the prison network made him invaluable to TMM operations. He managed communications between incarcerated generals and their outside lieutenants, ensuring orders flowed smoothly. But his inner world was unraveling. He became increasingly obsessed with identifying traitors, ordering hits on anyone rumored to have disrespected him or questioned his authority. The paranoia that had driven him to power was now isolating him completely. Even those who had once admired his intelligence began to see him as a liability, a man who brought too much heat, too much blood, and too much attention. Law enforcement was already circling. After years of surveillance and informant reports, investigators noticed a pattern of disappearances tied to Reyes' operations. Each time someone went missing, rumors pointed back to him. But there was never enough evidence to make a case. The gang's code of silence, the oath of blood, kept witnesses quiet, and fear kept them that way. Still, detectives in San Antonio and federal agents from the FBI began linking dots between murders in different counties, all leading to Reyes' expanding empire of violence. As his paranoia deepened, Reyes began to view himself less as a gang lieutenant and more as a general in an ongoing war. Every decision became a battlefield maneuver, every relationship a potential betrayal. He justified his brutality as a necessity, a way to keep order in an organization that, in his eyes, was becoming too soft. Those who hesitated to enforce his will were replaced by younger, more ruthless soldiers. The Texas Mexican Mafia was transforming under his leadership into something closer to a death squad than a structured criminal enterprise. The violence was no longer strategic. It was personal. But Reyes' iron grip was not unchallenged. Inside Texas prisons, surviving TMM generals began to see him as a rogue element, a man acting without council approval, undermining the gang's structure. Some wanted to remove him quietly, others argued for open retaliation. His enemies multiplied as fast as his victims. In the coded messages passed between prison yards and city streets, orders began to circulate. Reyes was becoming a threat to the organization. The same system of loyalty he had once enforced was now aligning against him. Still, Reyes remained convinced that fear was the only true form of power. Each act of violence became a statement of dominance, a way of telling the world that the Texas Mexican Mafia was still untouchable, and that he, Ruben Reyes, was its most dangerous enforcer. But beneath the facade of strength, the foundations of his empire were beginning to crumble. His soldiers were restless, law enforcement was closing in, and his own generals were plotting in silence. The very machine he had built to protect himself was turning against him. By early 2014, Reyes had crossed a line from control to chaos. The murders of Reyes, Bernal, Chapa, and Solis had made him untouchable in one sense. No one dared to defy him, but they had also made him a target in another. He had proven that he could eliminate anyone, regardless of rank or loyalty. Now his rivals were preparing to do the same to him. Inside the dark world of the Texas Mexican Mafia, the balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, the man called Menace was about to face a threat he couldn't control. By the spring of 2014, Ruben "Menace" Reyes ruled his corner of the Texas Mexican Mafia through terror and precision. His reach extended from prison cells to city streets, from drug routes to legitimate fronts. Yet for all his control, he was increasingly surrounded by ghosts, the men he had killed, the allies he had betrayed. The organization that now whispered his name with equal parts fear and hatred. Reyes believed he was untouchable, too clever and too ruthless to fall. But fate was preparing a reckoning, one that would come not from within his ranks, but from a man who had lived a double life, a police officer who had once sworn allegiance to the same gang Reyes commanded. Julian Pesina was not an ordinary cop. As a Balcones Heights police officer, he wore the badge by day, enforcing the law. But by night, he was entangled in the same underworld he had vowed to fight. Long before joining law enforcement, Pesina had pledged loyalty to the Texas Mexican Mafia. Even after becoming a police officer, he maintained his ties, believing he could balance both worlds, the brotherhood of the gang and the duty of the badge. For a time, he managed to keep his secret. But in the ruthless logic of the TMM, no secret stayed hidden forever. Reyes learned of Pesina's dual identity through whispers from his street soldiers. The revelation struck him as the ultimate betrayal. To Reyes, loyalty was the only truth that mattered. He saw Pesina's existence as an insult, a living contradiction of everything the gang stood for. It didn't matter that Pesina had once been a loyal member or that his intentions were unclear. In Reyes' mind, a cop within their ranks was poison, and like any infection, it had to be cut out. On the night of May 4th, 2014, Pesina arrived at a tattoo parlor in San Antonio, a business owned and operated by Ruben Reyes. It was familiar ground. Pesina had been there before, meeting with gang contacts under the guise of friendship. But this night was different. As he stepped out of his vehicle, two masked gunmen approached. Shots rang out in the quiet of the parking lot. Pesina collapsed, hit multiple times, his service weapon still holstered. He died where he fell, just outside the shop of the man who had ordered his death. The killers fled into the night, leaving behind a crime scene that would ignite a storm across Texas. The murder of a police officer, especially one linked to the Texas Mexican Mafia, was more than just another gang killing. It was a declaration of war. The Balcones Heights Police Department, San Antonio Police, the FBI, and federal prosecutors All converged to find out who had ordered the hit. Within days, investigators connected the dots to Ruben Reyes. They learned of his long-standing position in the gang, his history of orchestrating murders, and his reputation for eliminating anyone he viewed as a traitor. To them, Reyes wasn't just a suspect. He was the embodiment of the TMM's violent reach. As law enforcement pressure intensified, Reyes tried to act unbothered. He continued to run operations and meet with his remaining loyalists, but the weight of the investigation began to close in. Federal agents traced gang communications, monitored his associates, and began interviewing witnesses who had once feared to speak. Slowly, the walls around Reyes began to shrink. Even inside prison yards, whispers about Piscina's murder grew louder. Some gang members were proud of what they saw as a statement against law enforcement, but others were terrified of the blowback. Killing a cop had broken an unspoken rule. It brought the full force of the government onto their world. Within the Texas-Mexican Mafia, Reyes' authority was crumbling. Generals who had once tolerated his ambition now viewed him as reckless. His decision to target Piscina wasn't seen as strategic, it was seen as suicidal. The gang had survived for decades by staying in the shadows, but Reyes had dragged them into the spotlight. Behind prison walls, high-ranking TMM leaders began plotting their response. In secret messages, they ordered his elimination. To them, Reyes had become a liability, one that had to be erased before he brought the entire empire down with him. The hit came swiftly. Not long after Piscina's murder, Reyes was targeted in an assassination attempt orchestrated by other TMM leaders. Details of the attack remain shrouded, but what is known is that Reyes survived. For a man who had always lived on the edge, this was the moment reality caught up to him. The same organization he had ruled with an iron fist was now hunting him. His soldiers had either turned against him or gone underground. For the first time, the Menace felt fear. In the aftermath of the attempt on his life, Reyes made a decision that stunned everyone. He reached out to law enforcement. The man who had built his identity on power, silence, and loyalty now sought protection from the same system he had spent years defying. Whether it was self-preservation or a final act of defiance against the TMM, his choice marked the end of his reign. He agreed to talk, to confess, to reveal what he knew. The same voice that had once commanded death sentences now became the key to uncovering years of hidden crimes. Reyes' cooperation began with a chilling truth: the murders he had committed, the men he had buried, and the empire of violence he had built. He told investigators about the execution of the 3 TMM leaders, Bernal, Chapa, and Salas, and led them to the makeshift grave near Pearsall, Texas, where their bodies lay buried in the earth. Forensic teams unearthed the remains, confirming what many in law enforcement had long suspected. Reyes' ambition had left a trail of death spanning years. The confession sent shockwaves through both the underworld and the justice system. For the Texas-Mexican Mafia, it was the ultimate betrayal. Their enforcer had turned informant. For law enforcement, it was a breakthrough that unraveled years of secrecy surrounding the gang's internal operations. The man who had once been the most feared lieutenant in the organization had now become its undoing. But even as Reyes spoke, he knew the cost of what he had done. There was no going back. Inside prison, the TMM had a simple rule for traitors: they die no matter where they are, no matter how long it takes. By turning himself in, Reyes had signed his own death warrant. Yet perhaps deep down he understood that his empire was already gone. The Brotherhood had disowned him. His soldiers were either dead or imprisoned, and his reputation had dissolved in the very blood he had spilled. By the end of 2014, the story of Ruben Menace Reyes had transformed from one of dominance to survival. The man who had ordered the killing of a police officer and executed his own comrades now sat in a cell, protected by the system he once despised. He had betrayed everything he claimed to believe in: the gang, the code, and the myth of power. But his story wasn't over yet. A reckoning awaited him in court, where the law would deliver its final verdict on the man who once believed he was untouchable. When Ruben Menace Reyes finally stood before a federal judge, the man who once terrified gang members across Texas looked nothing like the ruthless enforcer he had been. The tattoos on his arms, once marks of rank and loyalty, now seemed like scars from another lifetime. He was no longer the feared lieutenant of lieutenants. He was an inmate, stripped of power, facing the total weight of the law. After months of cooperation with authorities, Reyes had confessed to orchestrating and committing multiple murders, including the killing of fellow gang leaders and the assassination of Officer Julian Pacina. For investigators, his confession was the missing puzzle piece that explained a wave of killings stretching across Texas. For Reyes, it was the final act of survival in a life built on betrayal. As prosecutors laid out their case, the story that emerged was one of calculated brutality and ambition. They described how Reyes had turned the Texas Mexican Mafia's military-style organization into his personal army, ordering executions for money, revenge, and control. Each killing had been carried out with precision, not impulsive street violence, but premeditated acts meant to enforce dominance. The murders of Bernal, Chapa, and Solis were presented as a purge of his rivals. The killing of Ulysses Farias as punishment for suspected betrayal, and the assassination of Julian Pacina as a declaration of authority against the world outside the gang. Witness after witness painted Reyes as a man consumed by power, one who had transformed a criminal organization into a reign of terror. In court, prosecutors didn't call him Menace out of habit. They used it deliberately as a symbol of what he represented. Federal attorneys argued that Reyes's crimes went beyond gang rivalry. They were acts of domestic terror committed under the banner of a criminal empire. He was not just a soldier of the Texas Mexican Mafia, one prosecutor said. He was an architect of its violence. Those words would echo throughout the courtroom as they sought the maximum penalty the law allowed. Defense attorneys tried to argue that Reyes's cooperation with law enforcement showed remorse. They highlighted how he had guided investigators to the hidden graves of the 3 TMM leaders, helping families find closure after years of uncertainty. They portrayed him as a man who had lost faith in the organization he once served, a man betrayed by the same violence he had perpetuated. But whatever sympathy those arguments might have earned was buried under the weight of his crimes. Reyes had personally executed or ordered the deaths of at least 5 people, including a police officer. For the court, redemption was not an option. In 2016, the verdict came down. The judge sentenced Ruben Menace Reyes to 5 consecutive life sentences in federal prison, one for each life he had taken. There was no chance of parole, no hope of release. The decision was final, as absolute as the orders Reyes once gave to his own men. As the sentence was read, Reyes showed little emotion. The same cold composure that had made him feared now seemed hollow, as if he had finally accepted that his empire was gone. His own words had ensured it. Following the trial, Reyes was transferred to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. It was a place reserved for the most dangerous inmates in the country. Terrorists, cartel leaders, and killers who could not coexist even among other prisoners. There, he would spend 23 hours a day in isolation, confined to a concrete cell, designed to erase any sense of human connection. For a man who once commanded dozens of soldiers, it was the ultimate irony: complete control replaced by complete confinement. Outside prison walls, the ripple effects of Reyes' downfall spread through the Texas-Mexican Mafia. His arrest and cooperation shattered the gang's hierarchy. Federal raids and indictments followed, targeting dozens of members connected to his operations. For years, the TMM had thrived on secrecy, but Reyes' testimony exposed its inner workings, its leadership structure, its rituals, its rules of discipline, and its financial networks. Law enforcement had never come closer to dismantling the organization. In a cruel twist, the gang's most feared lieutenant had become its most damaging informant. Inside the TMM, Reyes' name became taboo. To mention him was to invoke betrayal. In their coded communications, members referred to him only as the traitor or the ghost. His cooperation with the FBI marked him for death, though even the gang understood that reaching him in the federal supermax was nearly impossible. Still, the oath of the Texas-Mexican Mafia was clear. A traitor's blood must be paid for, no matter how long it takes. For Reyes, every day of survival was borrowed time. Over the years, Reyes' story became a dark parable, whispered among inmates and gang recruits. Older members used his rise and fall as a warning, a reminder that in their world, power was an illusion and loyalty was fleeting. Some said Reyes' ambition was his curse. Others believed he was doomed from the moment he mistook fear for respect. Either way, his name became a lesson about the fragility of power in a world ruled by violence. For the families of his victims, the sentencing brought only partial closure. The graves of Bernal, Chapa, and Solis were unearthed, and their loved ones could finally mourn in peace. But the wounds left by Reyes' actions ran deeper than the deaths themselves. His empire had turned neighborhoods into battlegrounds, leaving behind a trail of fear that would take years to fade. Even after his imprisonment, the myth of Menace lingered, not as a symbol of strength, but as a warning about how unchecked power corrupts completely. In the silence of his Colorado cell, Ruben Reyes had all the time in the world to reflect on the choices that led him there. He had outlived his enemies, betrayed his brothers, and destroyed the only organization that had ever given him purpose. What remained was emptiness, a void where loyalty, pride, and violence once lived. The man who had ruled through intimidation now had no one left to command, no one left to fear him, and no one left to trust. His story ended not with a blaze of glory, but in isolation. Reyes' rise had been fueled by the illusion of power, but his fall revealed the truth. In the world of organized crime, the crown always comes with a noose. The Texas-Mexican Mafia survived his downfall, but it was never the same again. And somewhere, behind concrete and steel, the man once called Menace fades deeper into obscurity, a ghost of his own making, imprisoned not just by walls, but by the weight of his own choices. For law enforcement, Ruben Reyes became a case study, a rare glimpse into how power, paranoia, and betrayal can consume even the most disciplined criminal minds. For the underworld, he was a reminder that every act of dominance carries a price. And for history, he stood as one of the most chilling examples of how the line between order and chaos, loyalty and treason, can vanish completely when power becomes an addiction. In the end, Ruben Menace Reyes was neither hero nor villain, just a man who mistook fear for respect and found himself buried beneath the empire he tried to control.